In September of 1867, a man named Joseph McCoy stood ankle-deep in the mud of a nothing town in Kansas called Abilene, a place with a dozen log huts, one saloon, and a prairie dog population that comfortably outnumbered the humans, and watched the first rail cars in American history get loaded with Texas cattle bound for the slaughterhouses of Chicago. Everyone had told him he was insane. He'd sunk his entire fortune into building cattle pens in a town nobody had ever heard of, on a bet nobody else was willing to make. But McCoy had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was obscene. A single longhorn steer down in Texas was worth about $4. Get that exact same animal, the same legs, the same horns, the same beast, to a buyer up north, and it was worth 40. 10 times the money for one cow. And the only thing standing between $4 and $40 was 1,000 miles of dust, flooded rivers, fever, and men with rifles who would happily kill you for the herd. So men made the walk, and men died on it. They drowned in the Red River in spring flood. They died of thirst on the dry stretches. They got trampled in stampedes and shot in disputes and buried in shallow graves with a saddle for a headstone. Over cattle. Now hold that image. Hold the dead cowboy in the shallow grave. Because the great-great-great-grandchild of the animal he died moving is sitting in a paper wrapper right now on a value menu for about $1. Less than a bottle of water. You could buy one without glancing at your bank balance. You could finish it walking to your car and forget you ate it by dinner. This is the story of how the single most valuable thing a human being could own for 10,000 years became the cheapest meal on planet Earth. And if you're into stories where the most forgettable object in your life turns out to have a body count and a trail of ruined empires behind it,
bull imagery
do the thing.
Strength and fertility
Subscribe.
In the ancient world.
That's the whole channel. Because here's what should genuinely bother you. We didn't just value cattle. We worshipped them. We carved gods in their shape. We buried our kings alongside them. And for almost the entire span of human civilization, if you wanted to describe wealth itself, the raw idea of being rich, you reached for a word that was, underneath, a word for cattle. So how does that happen? How does the animal that was money, literally, physically, spendable money, end up as the thing you eat because you're broke? To answer that, we can't start with the burger.
80.
We have to start with something much older.
Make a note of the 3 new
We have to
cows.
start with the invention of wealth. Let's go back about 10,500 years. Somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, in the region we now call southeastern Turkey, a handful of humans did something that would quietly reshape the entire future of the species. They took the aurochs, a wild bovine that stood 6 feet at the shoulder, weighed close to a ton, and would gore you to death without a second thought, and they tamed it. And when I say a handful, I mean it almost literally. Geneticists who've traced the DNA of every cow alive today came to a startling conclusion. The entire global cattle population, the billion-plus animals on Earth right now, descends from a founding herd of roughly 80 wild aurochs. 80 animals. One small, terrifying experiment 10 millennia ago, and everything downstream of it is the burger. But here's what made cattle different from every other animal we domesticated. A cow wasn't just food. A cow was a machine. It gave you milk, protein, and calories on tap without killing anything.
All right, move
It
on.
gave you leather
Steady now.
and horn and bone. Yoke it, and it pulled your plow and multiplied everything a single family could farm. And then, the part that changed history, it made more cows. A cow was a self-replicating asset that walked around, fed itself on grass you didn't have to grow, and paid you interest in the form of calves. Think about what that actually is. That's not livestock. That's a bank account with legs. That's capital that reproduces. And humans understood this immediately. Which is why, across almost every early civilization on Earth, cattle stopped being animals and started being money. In the Iliad, when Homer wants to tell you a piece of armor is valuable, he doesn't give you a price in gold. He measures it in oxen. One warrior's armor is worth 9 oxen, another's is worth 100. The cow is the unit of value. It's the currency of the poem. In ancient Rome, before there were coins, there was pecunia, the Roman word for money. And where does pecunia come from? From pecus, the Latin word for cattle. When a Roman said the word for money, he was saying the word for cows. And the very first Roman bronze money was stamped with the image of, you guessed it, an ox. And it goes deeper, right into the language you're hearing right now.
O Apis,
Our word,
son of the
capital,
heavens,
the beating
favored
heart
one.
of the entire concept of
We
capitalism,
invoke the gods
comes
of
from the Latin
underworld.
caput,
Guide this sacred
head,
bull to the
as in
fields of
a head
Aro.
of cattle. Chattel, meaning owned property, comes from the same root. So does cattle itself. In Old English, the word feo meant both cattle and money, and it's the ancestor of our word fee. And when you buy stock on the stock market, that word is a descendant of livestock. So sit with this. The vocabulary of wealth, capital, chattel, fee, stock, pecuniary, is not like the vocabulary of cattle. It is the vocabulary of cattle. Every time you talk about money, you are, etymologically, talking about cows. Which meant that for most of human history, eating a cow wasn't like eating a meal. It was like setting fire to a bar of gold to keep warm. To slaughter cattle was to spend capital. You did it for a wedding, a coronation, a sacrifice to a god who you desperately hoped was paying attention. In ancient Egypt, they didn't just eat the bull, they mummified it and worshipped it as the god Apis. In much of the world, the cow was too valuable to eat and too sacred to kill. Beef, in other words, was the food of the rich, the powerful, and the divine. For thousands of years, a plate of beef was a status symbol you could chew. So the question sharpens. If cattle were this precious, this close to holy, this close to currency, what on earth broke the spell? The answer starts, like a lot of things that reshaped the world, with a man looking for India and finding something else entirely. When Columbus sailed back across the Atlantic on his second voyage in 1493, his ships were carrying passengers the history books rarely mention. Cattle. He unloaded them onto the island of Hispaniola, and something extraordinary happened, something nobody planned. The New World was a paradise for cows, endless grass, no natural predators worth the name, a climate that ran warm year-round. The cattle didn't just survive, they exploded. They went feral, they roamed, they multiplied into the hundreds of thousands, and then the millions. Spanish colonists could ride out onto open land and simply harvest wild cattle like fruit off a tree, the animal that had been humanity's most precious walking bank account for 10,000 years had just been handed an entire hemisphere to breed in for free. This is the crack in the dam. For the first time in history, cattle were about to become abundant. But abundance alone doesn't make the burger, because there was still a missing ingredient, a way of eating beef that didn't require a knife, a plate, or a rich man's table. And the origin story of that is one of the great myths in food history. You've probably heard the legend. The story goes that the Mongol horsemen of Genghis Khan, riding for days without stopping, would tuck raw meat under their saddles, where the friction and the horse's sweat would tenderize it into something they could eat on the move. When the Mongols reached the edges of Europe, so the story goes, they brought this raw, shredded beef with them. It became steak tartare, named after the Tatars. And from tartare, eventually, came the cooked patty. It's a fantastic story. It's got horsemen and empire and a whiff of the exotic. and it is almost certainly complete nonsense. A legend stitched together long after the fact, exactly the kind of romantic origin myth people love to invent for the things they eat every day.
From these roots, the
Meat
great
under a
herd
saddle
spread,
for days
driving the
doesn't get
expansion
tender.
across the western
It gets
territories.
rancid. But the real trail is more interesting because it's more boring, and boring is usually true. The technique of chopping tough, cheap cuts of beef into something soft and edible spread through northern Europe, and it found a home in one particular German port city, a gray, salt-stained, endlessly busy harbor town on the North Sea. Hamburg. By the 1800s, Hamburg-style chopped beefsteak was a known dish, a way to make cheap, low-grade meat palatable. And Hamburg was one of the great departure ports for the flood of Germans emigrating to a new country across the ocean. They carried their language, their beer, their sausages, and their Hamburg steak onto the ships. By the middle of the 19th century, restaurants in New York were advertising Hamburg steak on their menus to lure hungry German arrivals. The dish had a name. It had an ocean crossing. It had a country waiting on the other side that was, at that very moment, drowning in cattle. All it needed now was an empire to fight over it. And in the American West, 4 of them were about to. Act 1. Spain plants the seed. Remember those feral Spanish cattle multiplying across the Americas? In the dry brush country of Texas, they evolved into something lean, mean, and half-wild. The Texas Longhorn. Horns that could span 6 feet. A temperament like a loaded gun. And by the end of the American Civil War, in 1865, there were somewhere between 5 and 6 million of them roaming Texas. Most of them unbranded, unowned, and worth almost nothing. Because Texas had all the cattle in the world and nobody to sell them to. A steer was worth $4. If you could even find someone with $4. Act 2. The Cattle Kingdom. That's the world Joseph McCoy stepped into. The $4 steer in Texas and the $40 steer in Chicago. The whole problem was the 1,000 miles in between, and the railroads that could cross it were creeping west across Kansas. McCoy's insane bet was simple. Build the pens where the trail met the rail, and let the cowboys come to you. They came. Over the next 2 decades, cowboys drove herds up the great trails, the Chisholm, the Goodnight Loving, on journeys of 1,000 miles that could take 2 months, moving at 10 miles a day. In 1866 alone, roughly 260,000 head went north. By the official government count, more than 5.2 million cattle were driven up out of Texas between 1866 and 1884. Some historians put the total across all the trails and all the years as high as 10 million animals. What one historian called the greatest movement of animals under human control in the history of the world. And the money that arbitrage unleashed was staggering. Fortunes appeared overnight. The men who owned the herds, the cattle barons, became some of the richest people in America. Investment money poured in from as far away as Scotland and England.
If we acquire this
British
parcel, it completes
aristocrats
the
bought
southern
vast
boundary.
ranching
Yes,
syndicates
the
sight
potential for expansion
unseen,
is significant.
chasing the returns. For a brief, blazing moment, a scrappy man with some grass, some cattle, and enough nerve to make the drive could become a millionaire. It could not last. It never can. The open range got overgrazed. Too many cattle, too little grass, prices sagging under the weight of all that beef. And then, in the winter of 1886 into 1887, the sky fell. A brutal, apocalyptic freeze swept the plains. Blizzards, temperatures far below zero, weeks on end. The cattle, packed onto stripped and barren range, had nowhere to go and nothing to eat. They froze standing up. They piled into fences and died in drifts. When spring finally came and the snow melted, the ranchers rode out and found their fortunes rotting on the ground. They called it the Great Die-Up. Some outfits lost 90% of their herds. The cattle barons were wiped out. The open range was over. But by then, the center of gravity had already shifted, because the real empire wasn't out on the prairie anymore. It was in Chicago. Act 3. The Beef Trust. If you're finding this useful, if you're the kind of person who wants to understand the machinery hiding behind ordinary things, this is exactly the stuff this channel exists for. Subscribing genuinely helps, and it costs you nothing but a tap. Now, Chicago. For all of history, there had been one iron rule of the meat business. The animal had to travel to the eater alive. You couldn't ship beef across the country because beef rots. So cattle walked to the city, got slaughtered near the customer, and were eaten local. That rule had held since the Aurochs. A man named Gustavus Swift broke it. In the late 1870s, Swift became obsessed with a simple, world-changing idea. What if you slaughtered the animal in one place, Chicago, and shipped the meat, cold, everywhere else? Railroads hated the idea. They'd built their entire business on hauling live cattle and didn't want it disrupted. So Swift built his own refrigerated rail cars, and by around 1878, he'd cracked it. Chilled beef, moving across the entire country, arriving fresh. The effect was atomic. Suddenly, a single slaughterhouse in Chicago could feed the whole nation. Swift and a handful of rivals, Armour, Morris, and the others, the group the public came to call the Big Four, later the Big Five, built an operation of a scale humanity had never seen. They controlled the cattle, the slaughter, the rail cars, the distribution. They crushed the local butcher. They set the prices. Together, they became a near-total monopoly on American meat. A monopoly so complete it earned its own nickname, the Beef Trust. And the way they did it was, in its own dark way, a work of genius. The Chicago packing plants took the animal apart on a moving line, carcasses on overhead rails, each worker doing one cut, over and over as the meat came to them. A disassembly line. A young man named Henry Ford visited one of those Chicago plants and watched the carcasses glide past on their hooks, each worker performing one repeated task. He would later say it gave him the idea for the moving assembly line, the thing that would build the Model T and remake the 20th century. The system that mass-produced the modern world was reverse-engineered from a slaughterhouse. But there was a price for all that speed and scale, and it was hidden inside the meat. In 1906, a writer named Upton Sinclair published a novel called The Jungle. He'd gone undercover in the Chicago plants for weeks, and what he described turned America's stomach. Filth, disease, rats, rot, men falling into rendering tanks and getting shipped out as lard. Sinclair had meant to write about the workers. Instead, the public fixated on the food. He famously said he'd aimed at the nation's heart and hit it in the stomach. The outrage was so violent that Congress moved within months. That same year, 1906, the government passed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The untouchable Beef Trust had finally been touched. The state stepped in to regulate the empire, but the damage to one product in particular was done. Because of all the beef in America, one form now carried a reputation for filth above all others: ground beef. Chopped up, mystery source, who knows what's in it ground beef. The exact meat you need to make a hamburger. After The Jungle, Americans were terrified of it, which sets up the fourth and final act, the one where the burger, finally, becomes the burger. Act 4. The Rehabilitation. The hamburger sandwich
you are,
itself
ma'am.
had been
Enjoy
bubbling
those
up at
sliders.
fairs and lunch
Thank you.
counters
They
for
look
years.
absolutely
It's
grand.
often said to have found its national audience at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, sold to crowds who'd never seen anything like it.
I hear this place
But
is
it
the
had that
bee's
ground
knees.
beef stink of suspicion
Oh, it's simply
hanging over
divine.
it.
The burgers are the
Respectable
cat's
people
pajamas.
didn't eat it.
One deluxe coming
Enter
right up.
two
That'll be
men in
25
Wichita,
cents.
Kansas in 1921. A cook named Walter Anderson and a promoter named Billy Ingram. They opened a tiny burger stand and made a bet that was pure marketing
Next plate
brilliance.
ready.
They understood
coming
the
right up.
problem wasn't the
Watch your back, hot
taste,
soup.
it was the fear. So they attacked the fear directly. They named it White Castle. White for cleanliness, castle for permanence and strength. They built the whole place out of gleaming stainless steel.
Here's your tray,
They
sir.
ground the
That'll be
beef in
$1.
Much
full
obliged.
view of the
Keep the change.
customer so you could watch it happen. Everything spotless, everything visible, everything the opposite of Sinclair's nightmare. And they sold the burgers for 5 cents each with the slogan, "Buy 'em by the sack." It worked. White Castle
Welcome
didn't
aboard,
just
gentlemen.
sell
This is the
hamburgers,
start of something big.
it made them
We're
safe.
ready to get started.
It made the burger
It's a
respectable.
solid deal for everyone.
It took the food born of the cheapest, most feared meat in America and turned it into a clean, cheap, all-American treat. And then came the machine that would finish the job. In 1948, in San Bernardino, California, two brothers, Richard and Maurice McDonald, tore out their kitchen and rebuilt it around a single obsession: speed. They called it the Speedy Service System. No plates, no waiters, no waiting. Just a limited menu produced on an assembly
Honey,
line,
this picture is
exactly
just
like
divine,
Ford's
and these
cars,
burgers are simply out of
exactly
this
like the
world.
Chicago
They sure are, doll. I
slaughterhouse
could stay
that
here all
inspired
night.
Ford in the first place. The disassembly line had come full circle. Now, it built the burger. A traveling milkshake machine salesman named Ray Kroc saw it, understood what he was looking at, and in 1955 opened the first franchised McDonald's in Des Plaines, Illinois. Kroc's genius wasn't the food, it was the system. Identical, repeatable, franchisable, exportable. He wasn't selling burgers. He was selling a template you could stamp onto any street corner on Earth. And that template is the moment the 10,000-year story ends. Because that's the moment beef stopped being capital. Here's the turn. For all of human history, cattle were precious because they were scarce. A slow-growing, self-replicating store
right
of
here.
wealth
Thank
you
you.
spent carefully. Every step of this story chipped away at that scarcity. The Americas gave cattle unlimited land. The Longhorn Drives gave them scale. Refrigeration and the Beef Trust gave them nationwide distribution. And after the Second World War, the final piece dropped into place: cheap, government-subsidized corn. Instead of letting a steer grow slowly on grass for years, you could now pack it into a feedlot and fatten it fast on mountains of subsidized corn. Cattle stopped being raised. They started being manufactured. Add the interstate highway system and the invention of the drive-through, and you had a delivery machine for cheap protein bolted onto every off-ramp in the country. And so the thing that broke the 10,000-year spell wasn't a war or a plague. It was efficiency. We got so good at producing the animal that had been humanity's most valuable possession that we produced its value into the ground. We made cattle infinite. And the moment anything becomes infinite, it stops being treasure and starts being a commodity. The animal that Homer measured armor against. The animal Rome named its money after. The animal Egypt mummified as a god. We put it on a value menu for $1. But the strange thing is, the story never actually left. It's all still here. You just have to know where to look. It's in your language every single day. When you talk about capital, you're talking about a head of cattle. When you pay a fee, you're speaking Old English for cows. When you buy stock, you're echoing livestock. When you call someone pecuniary, you're calling them, at the root, cowish. The oldest form of wealth on Earth is fossilized inside the words we use for wealth right now. It's in the map. The entire mythology of the American West, the cowboy, the frontier, the ranch, the rodeo, is the afterimage of that 20-year cattle boom. And it's not just history. Right now, this year, cattle ranching is the single largest driver of deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. The hunger for cheap beef is still redrawing the borders of the living world. It's in your economy. The moving assembly line that built the modern industrial age was copied from a beef slaughterhouse. The franchise model that turned McDonald's into a global empire, over 40,000 locations, selling on the order of 75 million burgers a day, became the blueprint for how brands conquer the planet. And it's in the bill we haven't finished paying. Americans eat around 50 billion burgers a year, enough laid end to end to circle the earth 32 times. And every single pound of that beef costs roughly 1,800 gallons of water to produce, plus a heavy load of greenhouse gas. We made beef cheap by making it limitless.
The animal,
but the true
industry,
cost
and the
didn't
impact this
vanish.
one burger has on
It
the
just got
planet.
moved off the menu and onto the climate, the water table, and the next generation's tab. The animal is cheap. The animal has never been more expensive. Which brings us back to where we started. To you. Standing at a counter, holding a burger, having just paid less for it than you'd pay for a coffee. Look at it for a second. Really look. You are holding 10,000 years of human obsession. The same animal that was once money you could not afford to eat. The same animal men killed each other to move across a continent. The same animal that was carved into gods. And here it is, warm in a paper wrapper, so cheap you almost didn't notice buying it, so ordinary you'll forget it by tonight. Because that, in the end, is what human power actually looks like. Not the palace, not the crown. Power is what happens when we take the thing we once worshipped, the thing we bled for, prayed to, measured all our wealth against, and we make so much of it, so cheaply, that we can throw the wrapper away without a thought. We spent 10,000 years learning to turn our deepest desire into something we could own, and count, and trade. The burger is what it looks like when we finally, completely win. If this rewired the way you look at the most boring object in your kitchen, subscribe, because everything on this channel is exactly this. The ordinary thing, and the empire hiding inside it. You didn't buy a cheap dinner. You bought the crown jewel of human civilization. It just costs $1 now, because we finally made more gods than we know what to do with.